Just to quickly start off, we'll do a little introduction. So my name is Aaron Wonders. I'm the Deputy Director at the State Board of Education. I think this is month 4 for me, so fairly new to the board. Joined in January. Prior to that, I was a Deputy Associate Superintendent at the Department of Education. And then prior to that, I spent time at the House of Representatives as a research analyst staffing the Education Committee. And I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Jessica. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. So Jessica Mueller, I've been the research and data analyst at the State Board of Education for the past almost 4.5 years or so. And a large part of my responsibilities are ADF accountability, but it's also looking at other research initiatives that the board is conducting.
Well, thank you so much for having us here again. So our presentation is talking through the College and Career Readiness Indicator, or CCRI. Just for kind of a macro level, the State Board of Education is an 11-member body, primarily appointed by the governor, with the Superintendent of Public Instruction also sitting on the board and holding the seat by nature of their office. One of the primary roles that the State Board is charged with each year is assigning A through F letter grades. If you want to go to the next slide, Jessica. So as part of the A through F letter grade system, statutorily, there are multiple components, including assessment data, and then also indicators of college and career readiness. The board in 2017-2018 had gone through a process based on legislation to redevelop some of the A through F accountability system, and the CCRI was a major component coming out of that, with it being incorporated for a significant portion of the letter grade. So the CCRI component is meant to reflect how prepared students are for entering post-secondary or workforce by measuring different activities that bring positive change for students and schools. Part of the theory of action with the A through F accountability system is that it is a quantitative measure that is assigned each year using quantitative data, not qualitative measures, with incentives for action that schools can take to impact both their letter grade, but also positively impact student achievement and student growth and preparedness when exiting the system. As schools look to develop their CCRI each year, some of the things to be aware of is that it should be a measure of the student's entire schooling experience to determine how they're performing on the different metrics that are adopted in CCRI and included in those CCRI sheets. So there are lists of activities that have different points assigned that Jessica will speak to that really dig into what are different activities that students can take while they're in their 9 through 12 experience that will then translate into points and therefore translate into the A through F letter grade. One thing to be aware of is there are differences in the business rules around CCRI for traditional schools versus alternative schools. Alternative schools are approved by the Department of Education and have a specific mission to serve specific sets of students. That would include students who are wards of the state, students who have a history of disruptive behavior, students who are significantly academically behind, but that is a separate process, and the board has adopted a separate accountability model for those schools. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks. One of the other key pieces in understanding the work of the board is what the difference is between the Department of Education and the board, especially in the A through F space. We have a very symbiotic relationship with our partners at the Department of Education. However, we each fill some different lanes. So we want to make sure that folks are aware of those to frame this conversation. So the Department of Education's role is primarily the ones that schools interface with the most, as they are charged with both designing and modeling the accountability system, but also collecting all of the data, including the self-reported data through CCRI, that's used to calculate the letter grades, which are awarded by November 1st, usually at the October board meeting. So all data is held by the Department of Education, and technical assistance and guidance is put out by the department on how different submissions need to go in for data, how your CCRI sheets should be submitted. And we have some of that contact information on this slide as well for further reference, in case you are someone that is submitting your CCRI data over to the department. The board's role is appointing members to our advisory groups. We have our ATAC and our double ATAC, which both model and review the business rules and the general accountability systems, and intake feedback, consider and provide recommendations to the board for potential changes in those models. Additionally, the board is charged with approving the models that the department puts together each year and awarding letter grades by setting cut scores based on data coming in for those models. We do greatly value feedback. We have our email and our phone number on there if there is feedback that you'd like to have. And we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of stakeholder engagement process towards the end. So I'm going to kick it over to Jessica to start walking through the CCRI calculations and components and some useful advice that we've gathered as we've spoken to folks in the field.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. Aaron, I'm sick right now as well, so I kind of feel like Andrea did in the first session where I'm just here, but prepared. So first, I'll start with addressing how it's calculated. So the CCRI is a final school score. That's an average of the individual student scores on those indicators. And this is based most easily on the current cohort year's graduates. There are some other criteria for their alternative schools that are in the business rules. The students receive scores for each indicators, and on the traditional, there are red indicators, which represent college, and then there are blue, which represent career. Students can earn points for either red or blue, and they can also have extra points earned if they're earning points in red and blue. So really it's supposed to encourage students to explore college and career. However, if they choose to go down one path or the other, they can earn the maximum points available if they choose to just go with career or college. The most recent business rules are published by the Department of Education, and this presentation that will go out after the coalition will have the link that goes to the Department of Education's website. The CCRI sheets that are published on this website auto-calculate everything, so there's no extra work need to do to determine what your school score is from those individual student scores. Traditional makes up 20% of the A to F letter grade model, the CCRI, and alternative makes up 35% of the A to F letter grade. So those are just two of the differences. These other differences that I spoke a little bit about earlier reflect that alternative schools are capped at 1 point for students. However, what they've noted is that most of their students are earning more than 1 point, whereas traditional schools can earn up to 2 CCRI points per student, and that reflects that 1 for college or 1 for career, and that if they're getting both, they can earn some additional points. There is an additional bonus point that occurs after the end of the calculation of the letter grade for traditional schools, and that would be maintaining 85% or more of the cohort being engaged in post-secondary education or military enrollment, or increasing the percentage year to year of those cohort students that are engaging in either post-secondary or military. So this is a really long list, which is in the business rules each year. And this is all of the indicators that are reflected on the CCRI. On the left is those that are reflected for traditional and alternative schools. And on the right are those that are just for alternative schools. On this left side, you'll see that a lot of it starts out with those college indicators at the top. So Grand Canyon diploma, AP exams, and then it moves slightly more into career readiness, which would reflect things like AccuPlacer, ASVAB, ACT work keys, and industry recognized credentials, certificates, or licenses, as well as some of those CTE pathways and completing the assessments for that sequence. The things that are unique about the alternative schools would be work study, workplace readiness, career readiness, and service learning. Some of these are to reflect the students that they're serving and the pathways that they tend to prefer to go into, which would lean more heavily into career readiness. So CCRI sheets are approved by the State Board of Education. They have not been approved yet for the 22-23 school year. That would be on the board's agenda for the April 24th board meeting, which is this upcoming Monday. At that point that they're approved by the board, they'll be released by the Department of Education on that website that's linked in this presentation. Once the CCRI sheets are complete, those numbers are transferred into the portal that is in ADE Connect called the A to F self-reporting data application. You may need to contact your entity administrator to gain access. There's some resources as well from the department to walk you through how to find out who your entity administrator is if you don't know, as well as how to get access to the application. If you don't, they no longer accept worksheets in the Excel spreadsheet by email. It's all entered into this application now. The deadline each year does not change. It is July 31st. This allows schools to gather more information on things like post-secondary enrollment, military enlistment, things like that that happen after the close of the school year, and getting some of those information back from students after they've graduated. If CCRI sheets are not submitted into that ADE Connect self-reporting portal, it will reflect 0 points in the A to F letter grade model. This is where schools would have the opportunity to submit an appeal on that indicator of their letter grade. However, there's no guarantee what direction that the A to F Appeals Committee or the board will take on something like not submitting the CCRI data.
And one point on that as well, Jessica, right? For folks that are ineligible to receive CCR points, you still have to indicate that on the sheet that you're turning in. If you just don't submit, it will be reflected as a 0 rather than removing that indicator from your calculation.
Yes, that would be correct. And in those business rules, it lays out what those eligibility requirements are. It's 10 graduates usually in that cohort year. So there are very few schools where this tends to be lower enrollment in those alternative schools in specific. I wanted to look at some of the data to show the association between CCRI and the letter grade that schools are receiving. So there is a very strong association between CCRI and the school's overall letter grade. Given that traditional is 20% and alternatives 35%, the association is stronger for alternative schools, but it's about a 0.9, and in the correlational world between two variables, that's very strong. So schools focusing in on CCRI has a strong influence on the letter grade. You can see that the average in the 21-22 school year for all traditional schools was 14.78 points over those 20. And for alternative schools, it was 27.30 out of the 35. And what we see is that schools who are receiving more than this average tend to get an A or B letter grade. So as once they're attaining those higher than average CCRI points, they're really bumping themselves up into those A and B letter grades. So at this point, I would really love to hear from you in the chat of what your main responsibilities are in your role at the school or LEA. Is your title more focused on academic advisement? Are you a college and career readiness specialist? Do you focus on student support, whether that's emotional, behavioral, academic? And do you sort of focus on the school culture overall? And which of these might you influence all of these areas as well? So seeing quite a bit of college and then some district level as well as just school. A couple. And so this would really reflect the experiences of those that I spoke to when I was learning what they do for their CCRI. And they reflected that they're wearing most of these hats as well. And most of their initiatives are focused on CCRI, but they really notice that that influence bleeds into the school culture and student support overall. So what we learned was that the direct impact that you have is evident in completing the FAFSA, because that requirement allows students to get into post-secondary enrollment. And there are quite a few areas in that where you can earn CCRI points for the student, and where there's the bonus point as well as at the end of the letter grade calculation, as well as built into some of those indicators on the CCRI. There are connections to CTE programs and industry credentials that you directly hold and give students access to. There's academic success that you're directly responsible for as well. And what we showed that A to F letter grades, you're having a large impact in those as well. That without the success in the CCRI, those letter grades tend to be lower, a C or lower letter grade, if you're not reflecting the student success in college and career readiness. The indirect things that they learned was that focusing on some of these CCRI indicators created explorative culture within the school that allowed students to see that there were multiple opportunities and pathways available to them, whether that was in career or college going. And overall, students were able to carry that from student to student rather than the counselor going to each student individually. And this also influenced student attendance, especially through CTE engagement. So some of the tips that the LEAs that I spoke with shared would center around some of these best practices. And these may be reflected in some of your schools already. I would love to hear in the chat if some of these resonate with you. The first would be that most of them offered a 1 or 2 or 3 credit seminar to discuss the students' goals in college and career building activities. This would be where they would learn to build a resume, write scholarship applications, as well as complete job applications, do testing like the ASVAB within some of these seminars as well. And the next would be that the student information systems, they really made them flexible to capture the data that is on CCRI. So in Power Schools or Ingenuity, they would have their IT support work to collect the information within those individual student dashboards that had some of those CCRI indicators on there. Right now, it seems to mainly reflect the college indicators from CCRI out of the box, but they wanted some of those career things built into it as well. So they did program some of those things. One of the things that they found most essential for success in completing the CCRI, as well as supporting their students from the day that they entered their doors, was to complete that initial transcript review. This allowed them to see what they had already started, what they had completed as well. What were some of those things that they didn't have the opportunity to explore in their previous school, but that they were interested in exploring. So this really happened. This happens usually as soon as they enroll, rather than at the end of the graduation year, where it's very challenging and difficult to collect that information and put it on CCRI sheet, because it put a lot of burden on the counselors to do it for all of their students, which tends to be in the hundreds sometimes at the end of the year. The other thing was that they found it essential to collect data on all of the indicators, even if the student had hit their cap of points. So if the student had hit their cap, they would still collect all of the information, and the sheet would show that. It would show that the student was over that 1 point, but it allows for them to see, well, here's the things that are really resonating with our students, and here's where we can build programs. Without capturing the data on the CCRI, they weren't measuring those things within their schools. They were really using that to create a loop of, here's where we see the need, here's where we need more support for our students to reflect the things that they're invested and interested in that are improving their success in their futures. That also helps when the department goes back to audit their information from the CCRI. So what they would do is, in the review of the rubric, they could look at what schools were doing and see, well, maybe the points need to be recalibrated in these areas because schools are really invested in them. So, and we're seeing the investment that schools are making, and maybe we need to reflect that into the points that are assigned to those. So adapting and flexing it there, just collecting more data. The other thing that I thought was interesting for the alternative schools to share was offering test readiness coursework as well. This was usually outside of in-school sessions. This was before or after school that they would offer these. And they would usually notice if a student had taken a test and was on the cusp or of reaching the next score bracket, and seeing if they could, if they were interested in reaching that next one, possibly getting scholarships for school, or also then the school getting more points on CCRI for that student. these were some of the questions that they said that they usually asked when they were thinking about college and career readiness and meeting with their students while reflecting those best practices that the CCRI is really meant to show. So the questions are really just focused on the student rather than the form itself. It would really be about, is this something that the student can put on a resume or scholarship application? And then where do some of those things go on the CCRI? How does this bring about positive change for students? So, and then how can they celebrate every win that a student makes, even if it doesn't earn the CCRI points? So maybe as before, the student wasn't close to receiving a higher score on their test, but they still wanted to offer them some of those test preparation and practice sessions because it was still important to the student and could open the pathway for them to enter post-secondary as well. There are still several challenges that the schools reflected. I asked about ECAP because this was something that we were hoping for more information from of how it could interface with CCRI. And they did state that ECAP doesn't measure the things that CCRI is, especially around career readiness. However, ECAP is one of those tools that they've used to identify student goals initially. And that initial exploration can actually inform some of that initial transcript review that they've done as well. So it is really saying what's the end goal that the student has and what's the runway we need to use to help get the student there. And then that runway is what's reflected on the CCRI. They said that they really had to rely, that it was a challenge if they relied on non-automated tools. So they had to use their student information systems to gather some of this information on students. The one example that was provided to us was that staffing allocation was really viewed as like a whole team, and that each person on that team needed to be able to fill in each role. That way, if something happened, then each person was cross-trained on each of these skills reflected in gathering the information, helping the student with accessing CTE coursework, or helping them get into a test preparation seminar. And they said that they leaned a lot on their head teachers for some of this work, as well as their assistant principals in some of these areas as well. They also, because of that period of time after students graduated, they said that they used June to collect those phone calls with students to continue to ask them if they received any admission into any post-secondary programs. And so depending on what their vacation schedules looked like, sometimes it's looked more like emails so that they can be more automated, sent out, and not continuously engaged. But they said they got better engagement through phone calls as much as they could. And then again, it was important to gather the information from the transcript when the student entered the school rather than later on through the semesters, and putting that into the CCRI form at that point in time that you're also seeing where they're at with their coursework. Recently, the Department of Education has explored some of these changes to CCRI, and those are being presented to the board as well. Most of these were brought up through the technical advisory committees. The first one would be the learning points for diploma seals. There are 5 different diploma seals that students can earn, and that link goes to the list of which those are. And those are now receiving points for either red or blue on their traditional. So I could count for college or career readiness. Some of these are arts, foreign language proficiency, civic engagement as well. There have been a few changes just to align the changes in assessment. So now there are points available still for the AV merit, for students who still, I think it was 2017 cohort, there are still students who have easy merit scores reflected on the CCRI. But however, there are two buckets now for ACT. There's the one that is based on the cut scores for the assessment. And then there are the ones that are based on the ACT college readiness cut scores. And so those are higher scores on the ACT, and they receive more points on the CCRI. Our alternative technical advisory committee recommended also doing this for the ACT work keys. They noticed that their students were achieving above that benchmark that was previously set on the CCRI. So they wanted to reflect that students were performing better than what that benchmark had said. And so now the students will receive more points for those higher scores that they're already receiving on ACT work keys. And that was really advocated because they were seeing a direct connection to Pell Grants, as well as just opportunities to engage with apprenticeships and career as well. And then this was already what the case, but CCRI bonus points are now calculated after all of the indicator scores are calculated. Before, there was just an issue with the code, and that wasn't occurring. Some of the trends that they reported were increased engagement from their students on foreign language, and they saw this as reflecting that college going requirement for some post-secondary institutions. And then the other trend that they noticed increasing was industry recognized credentials, certificates, and licenses. So then I think Aaron will talk a little bit more about what's to come next for the State Board of Education. And then we'll have
so
time for questions.
to wrap up our presentation, what's on the horizon for the board? Back in 1920, the board adopted a 5-year accountability plan. The goal of the 5-year accountability plan was providing stability and expectations for the types of things the board would be working on in modifying the A through F accountability system. The link in this PowerPoint goes to that 5-year accountability plan. For the 22-23 school year, as Jessica said, the addition of diploma seals into CCRI was on that 5-year accountability plan. Additionally, the plan called for reviewing the existing CCRI elements to do data analysis and understand what the utilization of different indicators looks like. Are there opportunities for additional indicators, and where is CCR getting us right now? So the work on diploma seals has been done and has been added into the recommendation that the board will be taking up on Monday. We're continuing to review through the technical advisory committees, the utilization of CCRI and the different elements within. But as I said at the beginning of the presentation, one of the things that the board greatly values in its work in modifying the A through F system is what stakeholder feedback looks like from a variety of sources. So there's multiple avenues for stakeholder engagement with the board. The kind of first level would be providing comments to the ATAC, so the advisory groups that are reviewing the A through F models. That can be written, that can be verbal, that can be sent to the department or to the board. Those are things that we really value, that group of experts. And I will say the makeup of ATAC is primarily folks in the field. So there's a few policy folks, there's district folks, charter folks, but it's really experts in the field that are digging into these different elements and providing recommendations back to the board on the efficacy, what the data is telling us, what the modeling looks like. So greatly value feedback that gets channeled that direction. There's also the opportunity at every board meeting to provide public comment before the board. That can be written, that can be verbal. The deadline for submitting that is Thursdays at noon, the day before the board meeting. So our board meetings are typically the last Monday of the month, with a little modifications here and there for holidays and that type of thing. But if you are wanting to submit public feedback to the board, Thursday at noon is the deadline. And very much appreciate, I know our board members appreciate hearing from the public, positive, negative comments, questions. All of that is very helpful as board members make decisions. And then in the future, surveys to the field, so more proactive outreach by the board, by the department, and understanding what the sentiment is and thought on some of these different elements in CCRI. I'll stop there, and I think we'll open it up for questions. I think we have about maybe 10, 15 minutes tops. So again, thank you all for having us here, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hi, Aaron. I got a quick question. Going back to the letter grades, I'm just curious, does the letter grades also indicate how much funding each school get from the government for the following year? I'm just curious.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So funding calculations are not a portion of A through F modeling. A through F is based on data elements for primarily performance-related things. The funding component isn't included in the A through F. There are other reports out there. So the Auditor General puts together a report on district spending. There's a number of reports from the Department of Education on that, but those components are not included in letter grades.
Yeah. The one thing I would add is that the tax do look at the association with Title I and other indicators of poverty when they're exploring some of the weighting in the model, especially with some of these cut points as well. And even when it goes to the board for the cut score recommendations in every October.
So real quick, the ACT, that's not considered part of letter grades, or how does that work? I was just curious.
So the ACT is part of the letter grade. So there's performance, proficiency, and growth are the two elements for high school that is measured by ACT. As we've been switching to it, there have been some differences. So growth this year will look a little bit different than how it has in the past. In the next year, will kind of go back to a more standard growth model. So yeah, proficiency and growth based on ACT scores is included, but there's not a direct component related to funding.
All right, thank you.
I see Dr. Bristow's hand up.
Yes, hi, how are you? So I have a question about the CCRI column about the CTE course and taking a CTE course that's outside of the traditional path. So the traditional path is 2 years of the same CTE course. Let's just say, for example, culinary. If a student then goes on to a 3rd and or maybe 4th year of culinary, is that considered taking an additional CTE course outside of the traditional path?
So currently right now, my understanding is that it would only reflect those first 2 years, or however long that pathway is for the CTE. The student would also potentially earn, if they weren't already earning this 100 level career pathway for college credit, they could earn points then as well above if those 300 and 400, those 3rd and 4th year programs are qualifying for things like 100 level college course. But right now there's no sort of extra credit for the student continuing to engage in a driven pathway that they've selected. But that's the type of feedback that the tax need to hear, I think, to reflect some of these.
But I'm specifically talking about the indicator below what the 100 level career path, where it says completes a CTE course with an A, B, or C outside of completed sequence. So the completed sequence would be year 1 and 2 of culinary. But if they choose to take year 3, that's outside of the completed sequence, but it's the same subject of culinary. Does that count, or do they have to go start year 1 of construction or something else that's different?
Yeah, originally it was designed so that it would be 2 different courses, but that's something where it should be specified in the business rules if they can continue. And of course, if a student is dedicated towards a pathway, they should be encouraged to continue on that pathway rather than diverge away from it. So that's something where right now it would only reflect those first 2 years rather than all 4 that they're continuing to engage in. So it's kind of above and beyond stuff that isn't on here right now.
So you're saying that's clarified in the business rules that I need to go look up?
I think they should, I'll ask them to clarify that it is just those first 2 years and that the 3rd and 4th are in the same course cannot be extra points for being completed outside that sequence. So they just get the two years.
Okay, thank you.
Melinda Villalovas.
Yes, hi. I just want to suggest though, besides that, yes, if they could clarify on all of those CTE indicators, because there is very little. I've had to do a lot of research myself and send emails in to ADE, and ADE sometimes takes a while to answer. And they don't sometimes have a very clear answer. So that's one of the things that if they could give a lot more definition with fine details on what counts for those pieces. I mean, so it would just help us a lot.
Yeah, so if you.
Thank you
Absolutely.
for that feedback. That's helpful for us to hear.
Yes, very much so. As I think sometimes those questions don't make it to accountability and research, and they're typically asked to the CTE unit. And
Right.
I don't think that they can answer about accountability. And I think the accountability staff had a lot of changes as well in the past year or two. And so these are some of the things where they're figuring out the answers as well. And as they're figuring it out, we can put it in the business rules so that it answers it for everybody. I think we've continued to encourage that, and they're very on board with that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there some of the questions that I had were sort of reflecting, are there things on the CCRI that currently you find that your students are very invested in that do influence their potential outside of the high school experience for their futures that are not currently on here?
Okay.
I've had many of these counselors ask about the Apple scores, if they would ever be included.
So I'm not familiar with what the Apple scores is, but that's something that I will ask the tax to report on their schools. What they tend to do when they're looking at things is they'll bring in their school's data on some of these things and present it and start to review it. So if they don't have any of that information, I might possibly message you as well to get more information on that, if that's fine. Ms. Villalobos?
Yes, that's mostly on second language and getting that certification and passing those requirements for the Apple.
Absolutely, that makes sense. What are the other things that have been successful to ensuring that the CCRI is accurate and completed on time? Have any of you used any of the videos that the department's posted about how to submit it, and have they been useful for you? And feel free to use the chat as well.
In our district, the district submits it for us. Each individual school does not do the submitting.
Okay. That's very helpful information, especially as the department is going in to validate what they're trying to put in place is looking early on to see if the school has submitted it. So looking maybe 2 weeks before the deadline, seeing if those submissions were all received and which ones where the gaps were. And I think usually when those gaps were identified, they were identifying specific school leaders and not looking at district leadership and contacting the districts to see if they're responsible for submitting it for those schools. So that's very helpful to know about some of those pathways. And so hopefully we can support the schools in getting some of these reminders out in July a little bit sooner than what happened in previous years.
I think I saw our 5-minute warning just pop up. So are there any last questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share with us?
I have a question. Back to the CTE points, if a student is in a career area like construction and they're in it for 2 years, then they receive points. When they take the CTE assessment, do they receive more points?
If they pass their skills assessment, yes, then they would get the points as well in that column. However, the student may be maxing out their points already if they've hit all these things, but having that information helps them determine if some of those points need to be changed when they're looking at the data.
And if they then, after 2 years, had another CTE program and they completed that in 2 years, more points?
Yes, then again, they might max out their points that they can receive for CTE, but that if that information is that's what the student experience is, I think it helps to have that reflected on the CCRI, and then it also helps to share that and think, well, students are really engaging in CTE. Maybe that's where some of the more of the funding needs to go into our schools, since that's what their students are interested in. So I think still putting it in there, even if they've already hit their max, can be helpful. And maybe it's a matter of they didn't pass the skills assessment 1, but they have in their second, and so then they might get points there too.
Okay,
I see
thanks.
a question in the chat from Arlissa Crank Townsend. Asked what the counselor should provide for the CCRI report. And so I can get your contact information afterwards and share some of these business rules as well as the contact for the department and others to see what systems can be used in your school to complete the CCRI report. It's fortunate that this is happening in April and not in May or June, so that there is still time to begin this work.
And just to follow up on that as well, as we've said, the board is taking up approval of the business rules at our meeting next week. So if and when that item is approved, more information from ADE will be forthcoming about what business or what CCRI submissions for the 22-23 school year will look like. So that's on the horizon.
I have a question about the calculation of graduation rate. Is there somebody that you can give me information on who I should talk to about that?
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Bristow. I can connect you with them.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about the FAFSA and calculating that. In the past, we were shared that a completer would count as a point, but also partially complete because they technically, if they can prove that they've completed their FAFSA, we can count those too. So that was one of the questions for clarification, that we can count both of those.
Yeah, from my understanding, it was just full completion. And this was a question that came up actually a couple months ago in the TAC as they were looking at this FAFSA measure as well. So it is just 0.5 points for completion, no partial.
So no partial, because we were told that if they were partial, that we could count them because a lot of times